There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of Stevie Wonder's performance on the This Is Tom Jones television set, when Tom Jones could have walked back out. The song was building. The studio audience was responding. Stevie was doing what Stevie Wonder did when he was given a stage, and given a band, and given permission to be completely himself, which was something that TV variety programs in 1969 only intermittently gave their guests, because variety programs in 1969 had formats, and the formats had rules, and the rules had been designed around the requirements of the format rather than around the requirements of the performer. On this particular night, on this particular stage, there were no rules operating that would have required Tom Jones to stay in the wings. He was the host. It was his show. The stage was his to walk back onto at any point. He did not walk back onto it. He stood in the wings and he watched Stevie Wonder play, and he did not move. And the decision he was making, though he was probably not aware of it as a decision, probably not processing it as a choice so much as simply not moving when moving would have been acceptable, was one that the musicians and producers in the room noticed and did not forget. Tom Jones had built his entire professional existence on the understanding that a stage was his most natural habitat. He was a man who expanded to fill whatever room he stood in, not out of egotism, though he had enough of that, but out of genuine physical necessity, the way a fire fills the space it is given. To watch him voluntarily stay still when the stage was available was to watch something that required explanation. He had been performing since he was a teenager in the working men's clubs of South Wales. He had spent more than a decade learning, by experience rather than by instruction, that the way to hold an audience was to give them everything, to withhold nothing, to stand completely in front of them, to make the gap between the performer and the performance as small as possible. This was not a technique he had read about. It was a survival skill he had developed in rooms where the alternative to holding the attention was losing it. And losing it in a working men's club in Pontypridd meant watching the men at the bar turn back to their drinks and their conversations while you were still trying to sing. He had learned in those rooms that the stage was not a platform from which you broadcast yourself. It was the specific place where you either fully arrived or did not arrive at all. By 1969, that lesson had been reinforced by every room he had ever stood in. He was the host of a prime-time television program watched by millions. He was a Las Vegas headliner. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most accomplished live performers of his generation on either side of the Atlantic. The stage was not something he was uncertain about. It was the one thing in his professional life that he understood completely and without reservation. To watch him stay in the wings was, for anyone who knew his relationship to a stage, to watch a man choosing something other than his own instinct. That was rare. That was worth noting. The explanation was Stevie Wonder. The performance began the way the performance was designed to begin, within the structure of the show, within the expectations of the format, within the framework of a variety program on ABC. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, the framework stopped mattering. What Stevie Wonder did, when he was given space and time and a band that could follow him, was to demonstrate what he was in the process of becoming. Not the child prodigy, not yet the fully realized artist of the decade ahead, but the thing in between, the thing that was more interesting than either of those, the thing that had not yet been named because it had not yet finished being made. He played with a completeness of commitment that was rare in a performer of any age, and that was striking in a performer of 20. He did not hold anything back for later. He put everything available to him, the technique, the feeling, the harmonic sense, the rhythmic precision, into the moment he was in, because that was the only moment available. And because he understood, the way a musician understands when the music is working, that this was not a rehearsal. Tom Jones, standing in the wings, understood the same thing. He had the option of the gracious host move, stepping back out to stand next to Stevie, to put a hand on the younger man's shoulder, to acknowledge to the studio audience that something remarkable was happening in their presence. It would have been warm. It would have been generous. It would also have subtly repositioned the center of the stage back in its customary location, which was wherever Tom Jones was standing. He did not do it. He stayed in the wings for the full duration. He let the performance exist without the frame of his presence around it. He let Stevie Wonder have the stage in the full and unqualified sense, not as a guest of the show, not as a young talent being showcased by the host's generosity, but as a musician who was doing something that required the full attention of the room and deserved to receive it without interruption. The producers remembered it. The musicians in the band remembered it. People who watched the footage in later years, knowing what they knew about Tom Jones's instincts and appetites and the physical relationship he had with any stage he occupied, remembered it as something that required explanation. The explanation was simple. It was the same quality that had made Tom Jones watch from the side of the stage when Janis Joplin was performing, that had made him listen when Aretha Franklin was speaking, that had made him seek out the people who sang in ways he could not fully account for. He paid attention. He knew what he was looking at when he was looking at it. What he was looking at in 1969, standing in the wings of his own television show while a 20-year-old musician occupied his stage with a completeness that the format had not designed for, but had been unable to prevent, was the early shape of one of the most significant musical careers of the 20th century. He got out of the way. That was the decision. Not the heroic kind, not the dramatic kind, just the simple, clear decision of a man who understood that some things needed room to be what they were, and that his job in that moment was not to perform generosity, but to actually exercise it, to stay still, to watch, to let the music be what the music was. Stevie Wonder in 1969 was 20 years old. He had been on Motown since he was 11, which meant he had been a professional musician for 9 years, which meant that by the time he walked onto the "This is Tom Jones" set, he had more experience in front of audiences than most performers 3 times his age. He had been little Stevie Wonder for the first years of his career, the child prodigy, the harmonica virtuoso, the extraordinary young talent that Motown had correctly identified as something rare and had, in the way of the industry, proceeded to market before fully understanding what it had. By 1969, he was no longer little. The nickname had been formally dropped. He was Stevie Wonder, an artist in the full sense of the word, with the multi-instrumental ability and the compositional intelligence and the harmonic sophistication of a musician who had been studying his craft at the deepest available level since he was a child. He played piano, harmonica, keyboards, drums, and several other instruments with the proficiency of someone for whom music was not a language he had learned, but the language in which he thought. What he was doing in 1969 was transitioning. The child prodigy years were behind him. The fully realized artist that he would become in the 1970s, the Stevie Wonder of talking book, inner visions, songs in the key of life, was not yet fully assembled. He was in the space between, which is one of the most interesting spaces any artist can inhabit, and one of the most difficult. The audience that had known him as Little Stevie Wonder had expectations. The audience that would know him as the artist of the 1970s did not yet exist. He was working towards something he could see and that he could not yet show anyone else. The "This is Tom Jones" appearance was part of that process. Tom Jones had invited him, had specifically wanted him on the show, because Tom was paying attention to the voices that were moving in directions he found difficult to predict, and Stevie Wonder was one of those voices. There was something in the younger man's playing and singing that Tom had noticed, something that did not resolve neatly into any category he could name, and he had learned, by 1969, to pay particular attention to the things he could not name. The category problem was real. Pop radio in 1969 could accommodate Stevie Wonder in the specific and limited way that pop radio accommodated things it did not fully understand, by playing the hits and not asking what was underneath them. The hits were real. For Once in My Life had been a hit. I Was Made to Love Her had been a hit. The Motown machinery had done its job of connecting the music to an audience. But what the hits carried on their surface was not the whole of what Stevie Wonder was. The harmonic language he was developing, the production instincts he was assembling, the compositional ambition that would define his work in the following decade. These were not things that existed in the hits as finished ideas. They were things that existed in Stevie Wonder as a musician, audible in performance if you were listening for them, invisible to anyone who was only listening for what they already knew. Tom Jones, backstage at his own show, had been listening for the thing underneath the hits. He had heard it. He had invited Stevie Wonder onto his stage because of what he heard. And when the performance arrived, and when the thing underneath the hits became audible in a live setting in a way that recordings only approximated, Tom Jones understood that he was in the presence of something that needed space rather than accompaniment. Stevie Wonder went on to become what everyone who was paying attention in 1969 understood he was becoming: the 1970s albums, the production innovations, the run of creative achievement that had almost no parallel in the history of popular music. Talking Book in 1972, Inner Visions in 1973, Songs in the Key of Life in 1976, the Grammy Awards, the Cultural Authority, the long, extraordinary arc of a career that expanded the vocabulary of what popular music was understood to be capable of. All of that came later. The industry would eventually catch up to what Tom Jones had understood standing in the wings of his own television program. Critics would eventually construct the vocabulary to describe what they were hearing. Audiences would eventually recognize, looking back at the early work, that the fully realized artist had been visible in the emerging one, if you had known where to look and what to listen for. Tom Jones had known where to look. He had known in 1969, when the 20-year-old musician standing on his stage was still in the process of assembling the artist he was becoming. He had known the way you know when you are in the presence of something that is not finished arriving yet, but that you can already feel the weight of. He had known the way musicians know things, not through analysis, not through critical vocabulary, but through the specific recognition that happens between people who have spent their lives in the same relationship to the same discipline. What came first, on a television stage in Los Angeles, was a performance in front of a host who understood exactly what he was seeing and had the specific wisdom and the specific generosity to stay in the wings until it was completely, fully, and uninterruptedly finished. Some decisions look small from the outside. Some decisions are exactly what they look like from the inside. A man choosing to remain still because the music required it. And because that was reason enough, and because he was the kind of performer who understood, without needing to be told, that greatness recognized greatness by stepping aside and letting it breathe.